Adam Niles, mob boss, murderer, legend, waited until the last night of his life to ask for a miracle. No one expected it to be granted. And yet, hours before his execution, Adam Niles, New York's most feared mafia boss, made a request so strange, so unlike him, the guards almost laughed. "Bring me to the Virgin Mary," he said. No phone call. No last meal. No final words for his crew. Just a prayer. Just her. What happened next didn't make headlines. It made believers. One guard wept. Another confessed to a secret he'd buried for years. And a man the world called a monster began to glow with something that looked a lot like grace. Stay with me to the end, because this isn't just a story about a mafia boss. It's about a miracle that unfolded behind prison walls. It's about how the most unlikely man became the center of something divine. And if you've ever doubted that redemption is real, this story might just change your mind. Now let's begin. This is the story of Adam Niles, a man who ruled the streets with violence, but died kneeling before the Virgin Mary. What you're about to hear will shake everything you think you know about sin, justice, and the quiet mercy that shows up when all hope is lost. It began 10 years ago on a day that smelled of iron and rain, when the courtroom fell silent as a judge read out the sentence, death by lethal injection. No one in that room expected what would come next. Before we continue, like this video and comment where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more exciting stories that you won't want to miss. The courtroom silence still echoed in Adam's ears long after the judge's words faded. Death by lethal injection. The phrase had followed him into his cell, into his sleep, into the corners of his mind that still remembered what it felt like to kneel in prayer. But years before the headlines, before the guns and the empire, there had been another room filled with silence, smaller, colder, and scented with candle wax and incense. That was where Adam's story had truly begun. Not in a courtroom, but in a church. He was born on a gray November morning in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, the kind of neighborhood where every block had both a bar and a church, and you learned early that sometimes they served the same gods. His father, Marco Niles, worked the docks until a crane accident took his life when Adam was barely 3. His mother, Rosa, was left with a child, a mortgage, and a grief that never stopped praying. She found strength the only way she knew how, through faith. Every morning she'd light a candle at St. Veronica's, whispering, "Bless my boy, Madonna. Keep him clean in a dirty world." The church became Adam's second home. Its marble floors and flickering candles were a world away from the noise of the streets. Father Leon, the parish priest, always smiled when the boy showed up early to help carry hymnals or wipe the pews before Mass. Rosa would watch her son in the front row, hands clasped, lips moving with quiet sincerity. To her, he looked like a promise, proof that goodness could survive even in a place like Brooklyn. She couldn't know that the same altar where he'd been baptized would one day mark the beginning of his fall. He was baptized at St. Veronica's on a hot July afternoon. The holy water had rippled when Father Leon's hand trembled slightly. He was old then, nearly blind, muttering Latin that Adam didn't understand. But Rosa did. She wept through the whole ceremony, clutching the small silver medal of the Virgin Mary she'd inherited from her own mother. When the priest said, "In nomine Patris, et Filii, et Spiritus Sancti," she whispered, "He will walk with the angels." It was a mother's promise made in faith, and a child's destiny sealed in holy water that would someday mix with blood. Adam grew up in the narrow brick house on 78th Street, where the neighbors knew too much and said too little. He was a quiet boy, respectful to his elders, but restless. By 13, he'd begun to notice the Cadillacs parked outside Salvatore's Deli, the ones that belonged to men who wore gold rings thicker than wedding bands. They were always laughing, always flashing rolls of cash. His mother called them men without peace. Adam called them men who never begged. When one of them handed him $5 to deliver a message across the street, something inside him lit up, a spark his mother's prayers couldn't smother. By 15, the errands had grown darker, the packages heavier, the smiles colder. He started skipping school, trading textbooks for brown envelopes filled with cash. His mother never asked where the money came from. Maybe she already knew. Every Friday night, she'd still drag him to confession, where he'd kneel behind the screen and lie to God. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned," he'd say, but his voice carried no guilt. Only curiosity. He wanted to see how far he could go before heaven stopped listening. The first time he saw blood, it was on the steps of St. Veronica's. He'd been told to wait there. Simple pickup, no risk. A man ran past him, clutching his stomach, blood spilling through his white shirt like red wine on linen. Another followed, gun drawn, eyes burning with panic. 2 shots cracked the air. The body dropped beside the baptismal gate, the same one where Adam's mother had held him years ago. He stared, frozen, as the killer spat, "Wrong place, kid," then walked away. That night, he told no one what he'd seen. Rosa noticed the trembling in his hands when he said grace at dinner, but she assumed it was the cold. He excused himself early and went to his room, sitting in the dark until the church bells struck midnight. The blood wouldn't leave his mind. He saw it every time he closed his eyes, mixing with holy water, spreading like a stain across everything sacred. And in that vision, something hardened inside him, a small, quiet decision that the world didn't forgive softness. The next day, he returned to the church. Rosa was cleaning the pews, humming a hymn about mercy. Adam knelt before the Virgin Mary statue, the same one that would one day glow before his execution. He looked at her calm, painted face and whispered, "You didn't stop it." His mother heard the words, but didn't understand. To her, it was grief speaking. To Adam, it was the first crack in the wall between heaven and him. As he grew older, the streets began to claim him completely. The men at Salvatore's no longer called him Kid, they called him Niles. He started running collections, settling disputes, learning the language of threats disguised as favors. Power came easy, like breathing. Respect followed, not from goodness, but from fear. He stopped going to Mass, except on Christmas, to sit beside his mother and pretend for 1 hour that he was still her son, not the boy the streets were shaping. Rosa prayed harder. She lit more candles, fasted on Fridays, offered confessions that weren't hers. "I must have done something wrong," she told Father Leon once. God wouldn't take a child from his light unless the mother failed first. The priest shook his head gently. "Faith isn't a leash, Rosa. Sometimes it's a door, and some children choose not to walk through it." She didn't believe him. She believed in miracles, even for her son. Especially for her son. When Adam turned 17, he witnessed his first execution, not by the state, but by the streets. A man named Vito had stolen from the DeSanti crew, and Adam was sent to help deliver a message. He thought it would be a beating. It wasn't. Vito was tied to a chair in a garage, pleading through a gag while the men laughed. Adam was handed a revolver. "Do it," one said. "Everyone earns their name somehow." His hands shook as he pulled the trigger, the sound exploding through his bones. They called him Niles after that night, a name whispered with caution. Rosa never knew the details. She just noticed that her son stopped looking at the Virgin Mary when he entered a church. His eyes went to the floor instead, as if meeting her gaze would burn. Father Leon tried to reach him, stopping by the house one evening. "Your mother says you don't pray anymore," he said. Adam smiled thinly. "God stopped taking my calls, Father." The priest sighed. "He's still listening, son. You just stopped talking." That same year, tragedy struck again. Rosa collapsed during morning mass, a silent fall between 2 pews. A brain aneurysm, the doctor said. Quick, merciful, unpreventable. Adam found her rosary in her coat pocket, the beads still warm. The funeral drew half the neighborhood, priests, dock workers, even men in dark suits who owed their fortunes to her prayers. Adam didn't cry. He stood at the foot of the coffin and whispered, "You prayed for me all your life. But now you can't see what I'm about to do." After Rosa's death, Adam sold the house and disappeared into the city. The Niles Syndicate was born out of grief and rage, an empire built from broken prayers. Within 5 years, he controlled half of Brooklyn's rackets. He made enemies, alliances, and history in the same breath. The church bells that once marked his Sundays now tolled for men who crossed him. And yet, he kept one relic from his old life, his mother's silver Virgin Mary medal, carried in his pocket like an unwanted memory. There were moments, rare, fleeting, when he almost felt the past pressing through the noise. A wedding at St. Veronica's he funded anonymously. A donation envelope slipped under the rectory door. But guilt is a stubborn ghost, and Adam had learned to live with it like a shadow. Every success, every act of vengeance, was just another way of proving that heaven had no power left over him. He believed in control, not miracles. Until control began to crumble. It started with betrayal, as it always does. Carlo DeSanti, the man who had once toasted to Adam's victories, began whispering to the feds. Deals were made, evidence planted, loyalties bought. Adam didn't see it coming. He had built his empire like a fortress, but he'd forgotten that every wall hides cracks. The night of the Queen's massacre, he wasn't even there, yet by dawn, his name was carved into every headline. By the time the police broke down his door, Adam had already stopped running. He didn't fight, didn't speak, didn't plead. In the corner of his living room, under the watchful eyes of half a dozen detectives, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his mother's medal. "Guess she gets the last word," he muttered. The officers thought it was bravado. It wasn't. It was the first prayer he'd said in 20 years, and it wouldn't be his last. As the handcuffs clicked shut, Adam looked out the window toward the city skyline. The churches stood out even in the dark, spires reaching like hands into the night. Somewhere among them was St. Veronica's, the place where blood and baptism had first met in his life. He thought of his mother's voice saying, "He will walk with the angels." Maybe he had once. But angels don't live in Bensonhurst. And they don't wait for sinners who stopped believing. What Adam didn't know was that faith, his mother's faith, had never stopped following him. It lingered in the echo of every church bell, in the flicker of every candle, in the statue of the Virgin Mary that still stood inside St. Veronica's. The same statue that would one day glow before his eyes, long after the world had given up on him. The same motherly gaze that would meet him again, not in a baptism, but in the hour of his death. And somewhere, in that quiet corner of memory where the sacred and the sinful blurred, Adam Niles, the boy from Bensonhurst, took his first step toward a miracle he didn't yet believe in. Adam Niles wasn't just another foot soldier. He was the kind of man who listened before he moved, and when he moved, it was permanent. After Rose's death, the streets became both his crucible and his cathedral. He climbed fast through the Niles syndicate, a crew that had once been known for numbers, rackets, and shylocking, but under Adam, it evolved. He had vision, precision, and most dangerously, nothing left to lose. By 21, he was the youngest enforcer in the crew. By 26, he was consigliere. What set Adam apart wasn't brutality, it was restraint. He didn't shoot unless it was necessary, and when he did, it was clean, fast, and often unexpected. His style unnerved even seasoned capos. They called him the architect behind closed doors, a nod to how he reshaped operations with cold logic. By 30, he was running the whole show, crown boss after a silent vote and a not-so-accidental car explosion that took out his predecessor. Enter Carlo DeSanti, charming, dangerous, and dressed like a Wall Street banker with a body count. Carlo ran the East Bronx and parts of Queens, claiming a bloodline back to Sicilian royalty and a pocketbook fat enough to make anyone smile. He approached Adam with a glass of Barolo and a handshake too firm. "We don't have to be enemies," Carlo said, voice smooth as velvet dipped in poison. "In fact, we could be kings if we don't step on each other's crowns." Adam knew better than to trust anyone who talked like a diplomat and carried two phones. But he played along. Their alliance was built on shared enemies and whispered promises neither intended to keep. Adam let Carlo think he had influence in Brooklyn while quietly securing ports, unions, and judges. The kind of power Carlo didn't even know he was losing. And yet, despite the blood on his hands, Adam never stopped visiting St. Veronica's, always alone, always after dark. The church was falling apart, peeling paint, cracked pews, a roof that leaked whenever it rained. One night, he left an unmarked envelope beneath Father Leon's door. Inside was enough cash to fund a full restoration, though he never signed his name. Guilt, perhaps. Or maybe he wanted protection from the one judge he couldn't bribe. He watched the renovations from afar. New windows. Fresh stone. A statue of the Virgin Mary, the same one he'd later kneel before in chains, was brought in from Italy, funded entirely by an anonymous benefactor. Father Leone suspected the truth but said nothing. He just prayed harder. Perhaps, in some quiet corner of his soul, he believed even Adam Niles could still be saved. But the streets don't care about church bells or second chances. With Adam rising, jealousy followed, especially from within. Carlo began stirring trouble, planting whispers in the ears of smaller crews. Meanwhile, Adam's younger brother, Tony, who had always stayed at the edges of the life, was pulled into it for the first time. Tony was everything Adam used to be before the blood hardened him. Kind. Loyal. Still prayed before meals. Adam tried to keep him away from the business, giving him small errands that didn't require a gun. "You don't belong in this world," Adam once told him. Tony just laughed. "Then why do I feel so at home in it, big bro?" On a rainy Tuesday night, Adam was supposed to be at Angelo's, a restaurant he used as neutral ground for sit-downs. But something felt wrong, a pit in his stomach he hadn't felt since the night Vito died in that garage. He called Tony and told him not to come. But Tony, trying to prove himself, had already left. By the time Adam arrived, the windows of Angelo's were shattered and police tape stretched across the block like a wound. 3 dead. One of them was Tony. Shot twice in the chest, once point-blank. Witnesses said he died with a rosary in his hand. Adam didn't speak at the funeral. He stood by the casket like a statue carved from regret. Carlo sent flowers, orchids, and lilies, too sweet for the occasion. Adam had them burned. Father Leone offered him prayer. Adam offered him silence. After Tony's death, whatever flicker of conscience Adam had left turned to ash. He locked down Brooklyn with an iron grip, sending messages in bullets and fear. He stopped funding St. Veronica's. He stopped walking anywhere without 2 bodyguards. And for the first time since his mother's death, he stopped visiting the church. Carlo DeSanti called, pretending to console. "It should have been me," he said. "You know that, right?" Adam didn't reply. But he knew. The hit was meant for him, and Carlo had orchestrated it. He just couldn't prove it yet. Power became Adam's only god. He trusted no one, loved no one, feared no one, except perhaps himself. Late one night, he sat in his penthouse, holding the Virgin Mary medal that had once belonged to Rosa. He hadn't touched it in years. It still smelled faintly of her perfume, lavender, and holy water. He looked out over the city and whispered, "If you're still there, I dare you to stop me." And silence answered back. From that moment, the man the world would come to call the Butcher of Brooklyn was no longer running a business. He was waging a war against his enemies, against his own ghosts, against any voice that dared to ask, what if there's still time to turn back? But there wasn't. At least, not yet. And somewhere deep in St. Veronica's, beneath flickering votive candles and the gaze of the Virgin Mary, a statue stood waiting for a sinner who no longer believed he was worthy of miracles. Have you ever watched someone lose themselves to grief, to the point where even love couldn't pull them back? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and if you're still with us, don't forget to subscribe for the next chapter in Adam Niles' extraordinary journey. The snow had just started falling in Queens on the night it happened, a soft dusting over sidewalks already marked by footprints that would never matter again. It was supposed to be a quiet transaction, tucked behind a shuttered pawn shop near Roosevelt Avenue. 7 men went in. None came out. When the cops arrived minutes later, the alley was painted in blood and cordite. Among the bodies was Officer Brandon Vale, a decorated undercover operative 2 weeks away from testifying in a federal mob case. News of the massacre hit like a grenade. By morning, every paper in the city ran the same headline: Mafia bloodbath, 7 dead in coldest hit of the decade. The NYPD released an official statement before noon, citing credible leads and evidence under analysis. What they didn't say publicly, not yet, was that an anonymous tip had already placed one name at the center of it all: Adam Niles. the butcher of Brooklyn. The tip came from a prepaid phone, traced to a pay booth in the Bronx, burned within an hour of the call. It said there would be a briefcase full of cash in apartment 3B on East 102nd Street, and a gun, still warm. When officers kicked in the door of the apartment, a known Niles safe house, they found both. The gun matched the ballistics from the Queen's massacre. The cash had blood on the edges. It looked airtight. Adam was arrested 23 hours after the shooting. No warning. No chance to run. A tactical team surrounded his downtown condo before dawn, flashing lights painting the windows like a funeral pyre. He opened the door himself. Said nothing. Hands already raised, eyes calm like the storm hadn't even started yet. They processed him like they would anyone else. Fingerprints. Mugshot. Paper suit. But the moment his name was entered into the system, the building went electric. Cops lined the hallway just to get a look at him. "That's him," one whispered. "The one who made a priest retire." Another spat on the ground. He finally messed with the wrong people. Adam said nothing. Not during booking. Not during interrogation. Not even when they laid the photos in front of him, bodies, blood, Bale's badge glinting under a sheet of police floodlight. His lawyer urged him to speak. "You didn't pull the trigger, did you?" the attorney asked, voice just above a whisper. Adam just leaned back in the metal chair and stared at the ceiling. Within 48 hours, the city had already decided his guilt. Pundits called him a terrorist in a suit. Protesters lined the courthouse steps. Officers wore black bands over their badges in honor of Vale. "No forgiveness for cowards," one sign read. "Hell has a cell waiting for Niles," said another. The indictment came fast. Conspiracy to commit murder. Possession of an unregistered firearm. Obstruction. Racketeering. They stacked the charges like firewood, hoping the whole thing would burn clean. The prosecution promised to make an example out of him, to erase his name from the streets the way he had erased others. The trial began in early March. Snow still clung to the gutters, and courtroom 2A at the Kings County Courthouse was packed shoulder to shoulder with reporters, grieving families, and cops who wanted blood. Adam walked in wearing a dark suit, not cuffed, flanked by marshals who looked like statues. He didn't look left or right. He didn't blink when the victims' names were read aloud. The prosecution brought evidence that sounded biblical in weight: fingerprints on the murder weapon, DNA on a glove found at the scene, surveillance footage from a nearby ATM showing a man of Adam's build walking away. They even brought in a priest from St. Veronica's who claimed Adam hadn't been seen in months. "Not since his brother's funeral," the priest said. "He used to pray. I think something broke in him." But none of it told the full story. Not the fact that Adam had been across town at a charity gala that night. Not that Carlo DeSanti had recently gone dark, unreachable, untouchable, suddenly flush with favors from city officials. Not the whispered rumors of internal betrayal, of crews flipping in exchange for leniency. The pieces didn't fit unless someone forced them to. Adam's defense team was overwhelmed and underpaid. Half the time they seemed to be playing catch-up, always reacting, never controlling the narrative. When they asked Adam if he wanted to testify, he shook his head. "Let the silence speak," he said. It was the only thing he said the entire trial. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Guilty on all counts. When the verdict was read aloud, there was no outburst. Just a quiet gasp from somewhere in the gallery, perhaps someone who once knew him as more than a monster. The judge's voice was steady. "I sentence you to death by lethal injection." And just like that, the empire of Adam Niles was declared over. But even then, even in that sterile, fluorescent courtroom, something remained. As he stood to be led away, a small object slipped from the inside pocket of his coat. A tarnished silver medal, the Virgin Mary, hands folded, eyes downcast in eternal sorrow. It landed on the marble floor with a soft clink. No one noticed. No one except the bailiff, who picked it up and returned it to Adam's palm. Their eyes met briefly. And for a second, just a second, the butcher of Brooklyn didn't look like a killer. He looked like a boy who missed his mother. He was escorted out through a side entrance, past reporters who shouted questions he didn't answer. Cameras flashed like lightning. Somewhere across town, a rosary burned in a votive dish at St. Veronica's. Father Leon lit a candle, even though he didn't know why. He hadn't heard Adam's name in years. But something in his bones told him this wasn't the end of the story. Behind prison walls, Adam said nothing during intake. He watched the guards like a hawk, but didn't flinch when the gates clanged behind him. They placed him in solitary on death row, an 8-by-10 cell with a single window, a steel toilet, and a desk that bolted into concrete. It would become his world for the next 10 years. And the world, the one outside, would remember him as a monster who went silent. But silence is never just silence. Sometimes it's grief. Sometimes it's guilt. And sometimes it's a dare to God, to fate, to whatever's still listening after you've buried the last piece of your soul. Adam Niles didn't cry. He didn't pray. He didn't write. He just sat there, day after day, staring at the wall. Not because he was empty, but because something deep inside him had begun to stir, something slow and silent and terrifyingly patient. Something that didn't believe this story was over. Because in a courtroom full of noise and judgment and vengeance, no one had asked the most important question. Why was the Virgin Mary medal in his pocket if he'd already stopped believing? The first thing Adam Niles learned on death row was that time didn't move, it leaked. Every second dripped like water through cracked concrete, slow, steady, impossible to stop. The cell was barely 8 feet wide, with a bed that felt like punishment and a window too small to see the sky. The air smelled of bleach and old prayers. The silence wasn't peace, it was pressure, thick and endless, pushing against the walls and waiting for something to break. In those early months, Adam didn't speak to anyone. Not to the guards, not to the chaplain, not even to his lawyer. Reporters begged for interviews, publishers offered book deals, but he refused them all. His silence became legend, an unspoken riddle. Some said he'd found religion. Others said he'd lost his mind. But the truth was simpler. Words had failed him once, and he wasn't about to let them betray him again. Every day followed the same ritual. Wake at dawn. Eat what passed for breakfast. Exercise for exactly 20 minutes. Return to isolation. Lights up by 9. The guards joked that death row was just an endless rehearsal for the real thing. Adam didn't laugh. He never looked afraid, but fear had a way of whispering even through steel doors. It came in small forms, the scraping of boots, the rattle of keys, the echo of a scream from 2 cells down. The chaplain, Father Kelly, tried for months to get through to him. He brought a Bible, a rosary, even a small painting of the Virgin Mary, thinking it might stir something familiar. Adam didn't even look up. God already turned his back, he said once, the only words he gave the priest. After that, Father Kelly stopped coming. But he always lit a candle for Adam on Sundays, just in case. The guards rotated often, burned out by the routine and the silence that hung like fog. But one of them stayed longer than most, Officer Mark Hensley. He was quiet, meticulous, the kind of man who followed every rule twice just to be sure. At first, Adam barely noticed him. Hensley wasn't cruel or kind, just efficient. But over time, he began to stand out, not because of what he said, but because of what he didn't. Hensley carried the weight of something invisible. His hands trembled when he handed over meal trays. His eyes darted whenever a priest walked by. Once, during a lockdown, Adam saw him clutching a rosary so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The man prayed under his breath, over and over, the same words, as if trapped in a loop he couldn't escape. "Forgive me, Mother of Mercy." There was a rumor among the inmates that Hensley slept in the staff chapel instead of the barracks, that he couldn't face the cells after midnight. One guard swore he heard him talking to himself in confession, whispering things no one should ever have to admit. Adam didn't believe in rumors. But one night, when the thunder rolled so loud it shook the windows, he saw Hensley stop outside his cell and stare at him like he wanted to speak, then walk away. The years bled together like ink in water. Each day erased the one before it. Adam's hair turned gray around the edges, his hands calloused from writing letters that never left his desk. He still carried his mother's medal, hidden in the hem of his prison shirt. It was the only thing they hadn't taken from him. Sometimes, when the lights flickered, he'd hold it up to the small window, letting what little sunlight there was hit the silver face of the Virgin. The warden called him our quiet case. No fights, no incidents, no visitors. Occasionally, the guards would talk about him like he wasn't there. He's either a saint or a psychopath, one said. Or both, another muttered. Adam ignored them. In a world that measured worth by noise, his silence was rebellion, a language only he understood. Mark Hensley became his shadow. He delivered Adam's meals, escorted him to medical checks, even handled the laundry rotations. He never made conversation, but his presence lingered like smoke. Sometimes Adam caught him staring through the cell door's narrow slot, as if searching for something on the other side. Not hate, not pity. Something heavier, like recognition. There were signs, little ones, that Hensley was unraveling. He started showing up to work with dark circles under his eyes. He jumped at sudden sounds. One afternoon, during shift change, he dropped his keys, a small thing, but the sound made him freeze completely. The other guards laughed. "Relax, Hensley," someone said. "He's not gonna bite you." But the way Hensley looked at Adam told a different story. He wasn't afraid of him. He was afraid for him. Adam's routine cracked one stormy afternoon in early spring. The sky had gone dark, the rain tapping against the narrow window like knuckles. He was lying on his bunk, half awake, when he heard the soft slide of paper against concrete. Something had been slipped under his cell door. He waited a moment, then stood, picked it up, and unfolded it. It was a leaflet from the prison chapel. The edges were worn, the print smudged, but he could still make out the words, "Our Lady of Sorrows, she never abandons her children." Below it was a prayer, one his mother used to whisper before bed. He hadn't heard those words in 20 years. His hands trembled slightly as he read them again, lips moving but no sound escaping. Adam looked toward the door slot. The hallway was empty. No voices, no footsteps. Just the steady hum of the overhead light. He slid the leaflet under his pillow, unsure why he didn't throw it away. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe habit. Or maybe, deep down, something in him wanted to believe that someone, or something, still remembered him. The next morning, Hensley didn't show for breakfast rounds. A replacement guard came instead, younger, less careful. When Adam asked where Hensley was, the man shrugged. "Personal leave," he said. "Couldn't sleep, I heard. Some kind of breakdown." Adam nodded, pretending not to care, but later that night he unfolded the leaflet again. The paper was damp from his hands. The ink had started to fade. For the first time in years, Adam prayed. Not out loud, not formally, just a whisper between his heartbeat and the dark. "If you're there, show me something real." It wasn't confession. It wasn't faith. It was exhaustion in its purest form. And when he finished, the storm outside eased, leaving only the faint smell of rain and a peace he couldn't explain. The guards changed again after that. Some new, some temporary. But Adam noticed that whenever Hensley's name came up, they grew quiet. One said he'd transferred. Another said he'd gone to rehab. No one knew for sure. But once, during cell inspection, Adam found a rosary bead caught under the leg of his bed, small, dark, and cracked in half. He turned it over in his hand, then looked toward the Virgin Mary medal he kept hidden in his shirt. Two broken things, he thought. Maybe that was the point. The leaflet stayed under his pillow for months. He'd read it in the mornings before roll call and at night before lights out. Not every word, just the line that mattered. She never abandons her children. He didn't know who had slipped it under his door, but he had a suspicion. Hensley had always looked like a man running from a ghost. And Adam knew ghosts when he saw them. By the end of his 5th year, Adam's silence began to change shape. It wasn't an armor anymore. It was a listening. To the whispers in the hall, to the prayers behind the walls, to the faintest echo of his mother's voice saying, "Our Lady watches, even when you turn away." He didn't answer her then. But for the first time since his arrest, he didn't curse the silence either. He still didn't know it, but the leaflet was only the first ripple, the first sign that his story wasn't finished. Outside his cell, beyond the concrete and the rules, something was moving. And it had started with a prayer that wasn't supposed to be heard. Because sometimes, mercy begins where words end. And sometimes, the quietest knock at the door is the one that changes everything. Have you ever felt like life went silent, only to realize later that something unseen was still guiding you through it? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you believe some silences hold purpose, subscribe so you don't miss what happens when atoms begins to break. The announcement came without ceremony. Just a knock on the cell bars, a clipboard, and a flat voice. Execution scheduled for the 18th, 6 p.m. Adam didn't flinch. He simply nodded, as if it had been expected, as if he had already lived through the moment 1,000 times in his mind. The guard lingered awkwardly for a second before walking away, unsure whether to feel relieved or unnerved by the calm. Adam sat back down on the edge of his bunk, elbows resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the cracked wall. Outside his window, the clouds had thickened, not storming, just heavy, like something pressing from above. 5 years of silence. 5 years of watching days pile up like bodies no one claimed. And now the end had a date. The prison chapel leaflet still lay beneath his pillow, edges curled from wear. He pulled it out slowly, fingers brushing the words he'd memorized without trying. She never abandons her children. He hadn't spoken that line aloud, not once. But it echoed in him now louder than the sentencing ever had, as if it were waiting for this exact moment. Later that evening, the warden came. Morrison was a stiff man, formal, detached, a career bureaucrat with a clean record and an ironed conscience. He didn't pretend to be compassionate, but he also wasn't cruel. "You get 3 requests," he said. "Meal, final words, and if there's a specific person you want notified." He didn't look up from his clipboard when he asked. Adam didn't blink. No meal. No last words. The pen paused midair. "And no one to see you off?" Adam stood slowly and walked to the cell door, his voice gravel after years of disuse. "Just the chapel. Just the Virgin." Morrison looked up then, squinting as if unsure he'd heard right. "The chapel?" Adam nodded once. "I want to spend my last hour with her. That statue in the corner. The one with the blue shawl and the broken hand." The warden leaned against the bars, puzzled. "You serious?" Adam didn't answer. But his eyes said everything. Words spread fast. Death row wasn't used to requests like that. Most wanted ribs or fried chicken, a cigarette, a letter smuggled out to someone who didn't care anymore. But a visit to the prison chapel? That was new. Some guards said it was a stunt. Others thought he was losing it. But none of them said it loud enough for Adam to hear. The chapel hadn't seen much use in recent years. Its paint peeled like old skin, and the air always smelled faintly of mildew and something older, incense maybe, or dust-soaked prayers. The Virgin Mary statue stood near the altar, her left hand chipped at the knuckles from when an inmate threw a chair during a service in '03. No one ever fixed it. But somehow, that made her feel more real. Officer Mark Hensley was standing in the staff corridor when the news reached him. He froze mid-step, his hand still gripping the coffee machine lever. "He asked for what?" he asked the young guard delivering the rounds. "The chapel," the kid said, shrugging. "Says he wants to see the Virgin Mary. Can't tell if it's sarcasm or he found Jesus in that cement box." Hensley didn't laugh. He walked away before the kid finished talking, heading straight to the locker room. He splashed water on his face, his reflection flickering in the mirror like it might judge him. His lips moved silently. "Don't do this. Don't ask for her. You don't get her." But he wasn't sure if the words were meant for Adam or himself. That night, Hensley asked to be reassigned. The warden denied it. "You've been on this detail for 5 years. If he trusts anyone here, it's you," Morrison said. "And anyway, what's the worst that could happen in a chapel?" Hensley didn't answer, because he had already asked that same question once before. And the answer had haunted him every night since. When he passed Adam's cell the next morning, their eyes met for the first time in weeks. No words, just a look. And in that glance, something passed between them, something that didn't need language. Regret maybe, or recognition. By the evening of the 17th, preparations were in motion. The execution chamber was cleaned. The gurney prepped. Witnesses were confirmed. But in a back hallway of Block C, four guards stood waiting, watching as Adam Niles was uncuffed from his wall restraints and transferred into shackles for movement. He didn't resist. He didn't speak. Hensley was one of the four. He held the arm strap like it might burn him. His breath came short. His hands twitched. Morrison noticed. "You good?" he asked quietly. Hensley swallowed. "I think this is a mistake." The warden frowned. "It's his request." "No, I mean," Hensley shook his head, searching for the right words. "He shouldn't be in there. Not alone. Not with her." Morrison raised an eyebrow. "Why not?" But Hensley didn't answer. Because how do you explain to a man who never believed that the Virgin might choose to show mercy in ways the living couldn't comprehend? The hallway to the chapel was narrow, dimly lit. Adam walked with measured steps, chains rattling like old ghosts. No priest. No hymns. No ceremony. Just the creak of a door that hadn't been opened in months and the slow, reverent hush that followed. When he stepped inside, the guards flanked the walls, silent as statues. Hensley lingered at the back, near the light switch. The Virgin Mary statue stood at the front, soft blue robes faded, her chipped hand reaching toward nothing. Adam walked forward, his head bowed, and knelt. The moment he did, something shifted. The air felt heavier. The silence deepened. The guard stiffened. And Hensley closed his eyes. Adam didn't say a word. He simply reached into the hem of his prison shirt and pulled out the silver medal, Rosa's medal. He held it up to the statue, as if reintroducing an old friend. Then he placed it at the base of her feet and bowed his head. No one spoke. Not the guards. Not Hensley. Not Adam. It was the most sacred silence any of them had ever known. And somewhere in the room, though no one saw it, a single droplet of condensation slid down the Virgin's cheek. Or maybe it wasn't condensation at all. Maybe mercy had finally found the one place left untouched by law, logic, or revenge. The chapel was silent, but not empty. Not really. There was something thick in the air, something you couldn't see but could feel, like standing too close to thunder. Adam remained on his knees, head bowed low before the Virgin Mary statue, his hands resting on his thighs, open-palmed like a child waiting for a blessing. The guards shifted along the walls, the clinking of their holsters the only sound in the room. Fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting pale light across the stone floor. The moment stretched longer than it should have. No one moved. No one dared speak. Even the air itself seemed to press down harder, as if the chapel had become a room inside a held breath. Hensley stood in the back, near the doorway, his hand twitching against the baton on his belt. He tried to look away from the statue, tried to focus on the routine, but his eyes kept pulling back to her. That statue had been in the chapel for years, its left hand chipped, the paint weathered with time. But tonight, something looked different. Not visibly at first. More like a sensation, like the stone was somehow watching. Adam lifted his head slightly, his eyes meeting the Virgin's with a gaze that no longer seemed carved in plaster, but alive with sorrow. Then the flickering started. One overhead bulb, then another. The light pulsed softly, irregularly, not like an electrical fault, but like a heartbeat. "Power surge," one of the guards muttered under his breath. The others didn't answer. One of them, a younger officer named Cruz, turned to Hensley. "You feel that?" he whispered. "The air, it's weird in here." Hensley nodded without thinking. His mouth had gone dry. It wasn't just the flickering lights. It was the smell. Out of nowhere, the chapel filled with the soft scent of roses, sweet and warm, undercut by something sharper, like lilies blooming after rain. There were no flowers in the chapel. There hadn't been in years. Adam inhaled deeply, as if recognizing the scent. His eyes filled instantly. He didn't try to hide it. He didn't blink it back. The man who hadn't shown emotion through a decade of prison, 2 deaths, and a murder trial now sat weeping in silence before a chipped statue in a forgotten chapel. "She never left," he whispered. The words floated out of his mouth like confession. Like surrender. Behind him, one of the guards choked softly. Another crossed himself. But it was Hensley who moved first. He took a step forward, then another, each one heavier than the last. His breath quickened. His hands trembled. And then he collapsed onto his knees in the aisle, the same spot where inmates once lined up for communion long ago. He clutched his chest, sobbing not with guilt, not with regret, but with the desperate agony of a man whose truth had finally become unbearable. "I lied," he said, voice cracking. "I lied. I lied. I lied." The guards looked at each other, stunned. Mark, one started. But Hensley shook his head violently, tears streaming down his face. "He didn't do it. He didn't pull the trigger. I knew it and I kept my mouth shut." The chapel froze. Even the lights seemed to still themselves for a breath. Adam didn't turn around. He just stared at the statue as if she'd been waiting for this moment all along. "I was supposed to testify," Hensley continued, sobbing now. "The evidence, the prints, the glove, I knew it didn't line up. But they threatened my daughter. Carlo's men. They said if I didn't cooperate, if I didn't say Adam planted the weapon." He broke off, gasping. "I told them what they wanted," he whispered. "And I let an innocent man take the fall." The guards didn't know what to do. Morrison had been called, but he was still 10 minutes out. Officer Cruz lowered his rifle slightly, caught between duty and disbelief. One of the older guards crossed the room and placed a hand on Hensley's shoulder, not to restrain, but to steady. Adam finally turned, just slightly, just enough to look over his shoulder. His eyes were red, wet, but his face was calm. "Why now?" he asked quietly. Hensley looked up. His face was wrecked. "She came," he whispered. "She came for you. That has to mean something." Adam turned back toward the statue. The light above her glowed warmer now, not yellow, not white, but something in between. Something alive. Her face, though unchanged, seemed softer, fuller, almost sad. "She came for you, Mark," Adam said, his voice low but steady. "To let you tell the truth. That's mercy, not vengeance." No one spoke for a long moment. Then Cruz whispered, "Look." All eyes turned to the statue. A single tear, clear, thin, slid down the Virgin's right cheek. It followed the curve of her face, paused just above the chipped edge of her jaw, and hung there in the air before falling to the stone below. It made no sound, but everyone heard it. The guards backed away. Cruz dropped to one knee. Even the officer with the rifle lowered it completely, his hands shaking. And Officer Mark Hensley, broken by guilt and lifted by something far greater than fear, crawled forward on hands and knees and pressed his forehead to the floor at the statue's base. Adam watched it all, silent once more. Not the silence of defiance. Not the silence of guilt. But the silence of awe. He reached again for the metal tucked in his shirt. It felt warm now, like it had caught fire in his chest. His mother's gift. His tether to a god he thought he'd betrayed. And for the first time in his adult life, Adam Niles closed his eyes and prayed. No words. Just presence. Just peace. And above him, the Virgin Mary glowed. The chapel floor was still slick with tears when the warden arrived. Morrison's footsteps echoed down the corridor long before his voice did. He had been pulled from bed, still in uniform slacks and an open collar, expecting chaos, a fight, a riot, maybe even a suicide attempt. What he found instead stopped him cold. For officers stood in stunned silence, their weapons lowered, their eyes fixed on the Virgin Mary statue glowing in the center of the room. "What in God's name?" he muttered, but the words faltered before they could finish. The light wasn't harsh or blinding. It pulsed slow, steady, almost rhythmic, like the beat of a living heart. The air smelled faintly of roses and candle wax, though the chapel hadn't seen either in years. In front of the altar, Adam Niles knelt with his head bowed, while Officer Mark Hensley sobbed uncontrollably beside him, his face pressed to the floor. Morrison looked from one to the other, trying to anchor himself in logic, but reason had abandoned this room. "I tampered with the evidence," Hensley choked out between gasps. "I lied on the stand. I let an innocent man rot in here." His voice broke on the last word. The warden froze, the weight of the confession hitting him harder than the miracle unfolding in front of his eyes. "Say that again," Morrison said, But Hensley just wept harder. "They threatened my daughter," he whispered. "Carlo DeSanti's men. They said they'd kill her if I didn't do what they wanted." The words spilled out like floodwater. Hensley spoke of the night everything changed, the night the case was sealed. He'd been a decade younger then, still trying to prove himself. The threats had started small: phone calls, letters, a black car idling outside his house. Then one night, as he walked his daughter home from school, a man stepped out of the alley and pressed a gun against her tiny back. "One report," the man said. "One favor. You change it, and we forget this ever happened." Hensley did as he was told. He swapped fingerprints, altered the forensic timeline, buried the ballistic inconsistencies under layers of official jargon no one would ever question. He thought it would be the end of it. But the guilt followed him like shadow through every night shift, every confession, every silent prayer whispered through clenched teeth. He'd avoided mirrors for years because every reflection showed him the man who damned another for his own salvation. Now, under the flickering glow of a statue that should have been lifeless, the truth clawed its way out of him at last. "I killed him," Hensley sobbed. "Not with a gun, but with lies. I let them take his life so I could keep mine." The guards didn't move. Even Morrison, hard-edged, rational, immune to superstition, found his knees trembling. He turned toward the Virgin Mary statue, now radiating a warmth that made his breath fog in the cold air. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, but even he knew this wasn't his doing alone. "Warden," one of the guards stammered. You need to see this." Morrison followed his gaze to the security camera bolted above the chapel door. Its red light blinked steadily, recording everything. "Control, patch me into the feed," he said into his radio. There was static on the other end, then a nervous voice. "Sir, you're not gonna believe this. The camera's been live the whole time, but between 2 o'clock and 2:30, it's just blank. Static. Like the system died." "Power surge?" Morrison asked, but his voice carried no conviction. "Negative," Control replied. "Every other camera's fine. Just that one." Morrison rubbed his forehead, feeling the night's weight pressing into his skull. "Save the footage," he ordered. "No one deletes a damn thing." He turned back to Hensley, who was now slumped against the wall, eyes red, whispering prayers into his hands. The warden crouched beside him. "You realize what you've just said, Mark? This isn't the kind of confession you walk back." Hensley nodded weakly. "I don't want to walk it back," he said. "I just want her to forgive me." His gaze flicked toward the Virgin Mary statue, still glowing faintly in the dim room. Morrison followed it, then turned to Adam. "Did you see this happen?" Adam looked up slowly, his face illuminated by the golden light that had replaced the chapel's sterile fluorescence. "I didn't need to," he said quietly. "Truth doesn't hide forever. Not even in here." The room fell silent again. The light dimmed slightly, but never fully vanished. It lingered like a promise or a warning. Within the hour, the prison buzzed like a hornet's nest. Radios blared, footsteps echoed, whispers spread faster than orders. The statue's glowing. A guard confessed. Something happened in Block C. Inmates pressed their faces to the bars, sensing the shift in air, the way one feels a storm before it breaks. By dawn, the story had leaked beyond the walls. The district attorney's office called within hours. They wanted details. Reports. Witnesses. Morrison, still shaken, gave them everything. The confession, the malfunctioning cameras, the statements from every guard in that room. For once, bureaucracy moved faster than silence. By mid-morning, the prosecution had opened a formal review of the Niles case. Hensley didn't fight the investigation. He walked into the warden's office, signed a handwritten statement, and requested immediate transfer to federal custody. "I'll testify," he said simply. "Everything I said in that chapel, I'll say it again. Under oath." Morrison stared at him. "You're ending your career," he said. Hensley nodded. "It ended the day I lied." Reporters arrived within 24 hours. They camped outside the prison gates, microphones in hand, eyes hungry for answers. Some called it hysteria. Others called it divine justice. The church sent representatives to verify the supposed miracle. Scientists offered to examine the statue, searching for natural explanations. None of them found one. The virgin surface was dry, but the faint scent of roses lingered long after the light had faded. Inside his cell, Adam listened to the commotion without reaction. He didn't ask for updates. He didn't celebrate the reopening of his case. He just sat on the edge of his bunk, staring at the same cracked wall that had held his silence for 10 years. For the first time, though, the quiet didn't feel like punishment. It felt like peace. When Morrison came to see him the next evening, he didn't know what to say. "They're calling it a miracle," he muttered, half embarrassed, half awed. "I don't know what to call it." Adam met his gaze. "Call it truth," he said. "The kind that burns before it heals." Morrison nodded slowly. He couldn't argue with that. In the days that followed, Hensley's confession unraveled a decade of lies. Forensic reports were re-examined. Witnesses re-interviewed. Hidden connections between the Dasani family and key officials surfaced like rot beneath polished marble. Every piece fit too neatly for coincidence. The truth was ugly, but it was also liberating. For the first time, someone besides Adam paid for the sins tied to his name. Yet, despite everything, Adam didn't ask for freedom. When Father Kelly returned to the prison to offer confession, Adam declined. "I've already been heard," he said simply. "By someone higher than you or me." The priest nodded, tears in his eyes. "Then may she keep you," he whispered. "She already does," Adam replied. The chapel was sealed temporarily after the incident. Technicians replaced the bulbs, cleaned the marble, and reset the cameras. But those who had been there that night said it never felt the same. The air still hummed faintly, as if it remembered. Even after the glow had vanished, the room seemed alive, a heartbeat lingering in stone. And when the clock struck 2 a.m., some claimed they still smelled roses. Do you believe the truth always finds its way to the surface, or are some miracles the only way it ever can? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if this story has you questioning fate, stay with us by subscribing for the next chapter of Adam Niles' miraculous journey. 10 hours before the needle was set to drop, a phone call came in from the governor's office. The voice on the other end was terse, direct, almost breathless. "The execution is suspended. Effective immediately. No ceremony. No apology. Just a decision made under the pressure of headlines, legal briefs, and 1,000 voices shouting one word louder than all the others: injustice." By morning, the news was everywhere. Death row miracle. Inmate's case reopened after officer's stunning confession. Editorials called for deeper investigations. Church leaders called it divine intervention. Protesters, once chanting for death, now held candles outside the gates, whispering prayers they hadn't spoken in years. But inside the prison, Adam Niles remained still, unmoved by the headlines, untouched by the noise. He didn't ask what the papers were saying or who believed him now. He already knew, truth didn't need to shout. It just had to stand long enough for the world to quiet down and listen. And now, it finally had. DeSantis' name hit the news like a hammer, indicted on charges ranging from obstruction to conspiracy, tied directly to fabricated evidence and bribed testimonies. Several others followed, dragged into the light like cockroaches scattering from flame. Adam's conviction wasn't formally overturned, not yet. The courts were slow, cautious, hesitant to admit their mistakes. But the clemency was granted. His sentence commuted to life, pending full reinvestigation. The paperwork used terms like temporary relief and further review, but the guards all knew what it really meant. The state didn't want to execute a man the Virgin Mary had chosen to weep for. He didn't smile when they told him. He simply nodded, then asked if the chapel would be open that evening. That became his routine. Each morning and night, escorted under heavy watch but no longer in shackles, Adam would enter the quiet room with the peeling paint and bow his head before the statue. Not in desperation. Not in pleading. But in something deeper: reverence, maybe. Or understanding. Inmates started watching him differently. Some called him Padre, half joking, half serious. Others began requesting to speak with him. Not about crime. Not about court. But about guilt. About silence. About what it means to hope for something you're sure you don't deserve. Adam listened. He didn't offer absolution, just presence. Sometimes he quoted his mother. Our Lady never abandons her children. Other times, he just sat with them. A hand on his shoulder. A nod in the dark. It was more comfort than many had ever known. He started writing letters. Long, handwritten pages scratched onto the same prison stationery he'd once used to file silent appeals. The first went to Officer Brandon Vale's widow, the cop whose death had ignited the whole fire. I know this doesn't bring him back, he wrote. And I know innocence doesn't erase pain. But if your heart ever finds space for truth, know that I carry his name in my prayers. And I always will. He wrote to the church. To the archbishop. To his old parish at St. Veronica's. Letters that didn't ask for recognition or salvation, only gratitude for the statue, for the prayers that lingered in its folds of plaster, for the mercy that had found him before the justice system ever did. Each envelope carried the same closing: she came. I saw her. I believe. He even wrote to his mother, or rather, to her memory. A letter never meant to be mailed. Folded and tucked behind the statue's base, in the chapel corner where he first broke down. You were right, he wrote. You said she watches, even when we turn away. And I think maybe you were watching too. Those weeks were unlike anything the prison had seen. Officers became quieter around him. Not deferent, not exactly, but aware. Some brought rosaries to work, tucked inside jacket pockets or looped around wrists. One guard, a lifelong atheist, lit a candle outside the chapel after his shift, just because it felt wrong not to. Still, the world outside didn't wait. Trials proceeded. Prosecutors pivoted. DeSanti's empire collapsed piece by piece as witnesses stepped out from the shadows. One after another, stories emerged of falsified records, paid-off jurors, and threats made to families like Hensley's. The house of cards had fallen. And Adam Niles, the man once known only for silence and blood, stood quietly in the ruins, not vengeful, not angry, just still. On his final night under death watch protocol, Adam requested something strange. Move the statue, he told the new shift captain. Just for tonight. Let her stay with me. The officer frowned. That thing weighs 100 pounds. Then make it 2 guards, Adam replied. She's all I'm asking for. They granted it. No one argued. The Virgin Mary, chipped hand and all, was wheeled down the corridor in a dolly cart borrowed from the kitchen. Inmates pressed against their bars as she passed, some crossing themselves, others whispering her name. One even sang an old Italian hymn until the warden told him to knock it off. But none laughed. Not that night. She was placed at the foot of Adam's bed, just left of the window where moonlight barely touched the wall. He sat before her like always, his fingers tracing the folds of her robe, the small tear line across her left cheek. You waited, he whispered. And I almost missed you. Then he bowed his head. And prayed. It was the longest prayer he ever said. Not for himself. But for every man still behind steel. Every mother still lighting candles. Every officer still haunted by what they'd buried. And for a world that forgets, sometimes, that grace doesn't follow rules. That night, for the first time in years, he slept. And he dreamed not of chains, or gunshots, or judges with cold eyes. He dreamed of water, clear and cool, and a voice he hadn't heard since he was a child. Welcome back, my son, it said. We never stopped waiting. At exactly 2:57 a.m. on the morning Adam Niles was once scheduled to die, the corridor outside his cell was silent. The overnight shift had changed 2 hours earlier, and most of the prison was asleep or pretending to be. In the surveillance room, a technician noted a flicker on one of the monitors, cell 23A. He leaned in, tapped the glass, then smacked the side of the monitor as static bled across the screen. Then, just as suddenly, it went black. It stayed that way for 8 minutes. No motion. No audio. Just soft hissing static, like a broken radio lost in time. At 3:05, the feed returned. Adam was no longer on his bunk. He was kneeling before the Virgin Mary statue, head bowed, hands resting gently on her chipped fingers. His body was still, unmoving. When the guards found him at 4 a.m., they thought he was praying. It wasn't until one of them touched his shoulder that they realized the truth. He was gone. Not violently, not tragically. Just gone. No struggle. No fear. Just peace. A prison medic arrived within minutes, followed by Warden Morrison. The cell was quiet, glowing faintly in the dark. Morrison had seen executions, suicides, overdoses, but never anything like this. Adam's face was soft, almost smiling. His right hand still clutched the Virgin's robe. The statue was wet. At first, they assumed condensation. The room was cold, after all. But the liquid on her cheeks didn't bead like moisture. It traced clean lines, from the corners of her eyes down to her chin. One of the guards touched it, then crossed himself immediately. "It's warm," he whispered. No one spoke after that. Security footage confirmed the anomaly. The chapel camera from weeks earlier had glitched for 30 minutes. Now the cell feed, dead from 2:57 to 3:05, returned just in time to catch the stillness of a man who had somehow escaped death by walking into grace. Technicians found no mechanical issues. No faulty wiring. Every other feed had been fully operational. Word spread within hours. The warden tried to control the leak, but there are some things you can't cage. A local journalist got hold of the story, then a national outlet. By noon, the prison gates were lined with cameras, clergy, skeptics, and believers alike. "The last miracle," one headline screamed. Another read, "Death row inmate dies peacefully. Virgin Mary statue wept during final hours." The church dispatched investigators. A team of clergy, theologians, and scholars entered the prison in silence and left shaken. "We can't explain what we saw," one of them said during a press briefing. "But we believe it. No trickery. No chemicals." The statue's composition hadn't changed, but the emotional residue, the weight of what had occurred, remained in the room like an echo that refused to fade. The Virgin Mary statue was eventually removed from the cell and returned to the prison chapel. But the requests didn't stop. Families of inmates, local parishioners, even ex-cops began visiting the chapel with candles, flowers, and prayers. They'd stand before her in silence, sometimes for minutes, sometimes for hours. Many left in tears. A few claimed they heard whispers. One man swore the scent of roses filled the air for a full minute after his prayer. A year later, the prison officially decommissioned the chapel and donated the statue to St. Veronica's Church in Bensonhurst, the same church where Adam had been baptized, where his mother had once whispered prayers with tired hands, where his crimes had first been foreshadowed, and where, years later, his name would be spoken with reverence, not fear. The Virgin Mary was placed in a special alcove just left of the altar. A small bronze plaque sat beneath her feet, in memory of Adam Niles, who found peace in the arms of mercy. To this day, the tear stains remain visible on her cheeks. People come from all over now. Inmates granted temporary leave. Officers no longer in uniform. Families of victims who'd never known closure. They kneel before her, light candles, whisper names, and weep. They don't all believe, but they all feel. Most of the guards who were in the chapel that night left corrections entirely. Crews joined a faith-based reform coalition. Another started working with at-risk youth. Two converted to Catholicism and now lead prison ministries. Even Warden Morrison eventually resigned. He told a reporter, "I ran a place built to break men. But I watched something holy walk through those walls. That's not something you forget." And then there was Hensley. After his confession and cooperation in the DeSanti trials, he was offered witness protection. He declined. "No more hiding," he said. "I lived in a lie long enough." He now speaks publicly about his role in the corruption, testifying before lawmakers about the cost of silence and the burden of guilt. He carries with him a rosary made from prison beads and a copy of the leaflet Adam once found under his door. The Niles Foundation for Justice was established 2 years later. Funded in part by anonymous donors and supported by civil rights advocates, it provides legal aid to the wrongfully convicted, mental health support for families, and spiritual counseling for ex-offenders. They don't market themselves as religious, but the statue appears on their logo, faintly behind a flame of hope. The first scholarship awarded by the foundation went to the daughter of a man who had spent 12 years in prison for a crime later overturned. Her essay was titled Faith in the Shadows. She ended it with a quote, "He lived in sin, but he died in peace. And those who witnessed it were never the same again. Neither were we." Thank you for listening to this story until the very end. There's another interesting one on your left screen that I think you'll really enjoy.